Welcome back, travelers, to the Planeswalker's Tome, your portal to the realms of Magic the Gathering. Whether you're joining us on YouTube or through our podcast, we're thrilled to have you along for the journey. Before we delve into today's chapter, a quick legal note. While we're diving into the rich world crafted by Wizards of the Coast, it's important to remember that this is an unofficial audiobook produced with love and respect for the original content. Rest assured, our endeavor is fully compliant with the 2017 Wizards of the Coast fan content policy. Now let us resume our exploration of The Eternal Ice by Jeff Grubb. Chapter 8, Skyknight. Having stated that Kejildor was a great nation, most historians then assume it was a single autonomous unit, like the desert tribes under Mishra, or the Church of Tal. Actually, it was riven through and through with innumerable cracks, schisms, rivalry, and petty politics. To prove this, you only have to examine the plethora of recognized military units in the nation. Not only was there a guard, but there's an elite guard, and on top of that a royal guard, charged with protecting the kings. There were cavalry units that served only particular fiefs, and naval units that pledged themselves only to particular merchant houses or trade routes. Each of the various holy orders had its own regular and elite units as well, and there were orders for every Kejildorian virtue, with a new one appearing each generation. Any military man with enough wits to win a few battles, and enough political savvy to choose good allies, could establish his own order in his lifetime. A magical organization of Kejildor were little better, if only because there are fewer mages. Soldev seemed to draw the artificers, but there's a hodgepodge of styles and schools in Krav, sorcerers, elementalists, and mediums all were recognized factions in the last years of the Ice Age. A great schism had occurred only a generation before Phrailes' spell, when Zur the Enchanter, in a quest for his own immortality, decimated the ranks by leading a revolt against the established magical leaders and retreating into the hinterlands. Zur's eventual and mysterious disappearance did nothing to hinder the belief of his followers in his works, and they made one of the more irritant up to the dissolution of Kejildor itself. To belabor the obvious analogy, Kejildor was akin to a block of ice, solid, weighty, and impressive, but if struck just right, cracks would appear and reduce the entire block to nothing more than tiny shards. One only needed to know where to strike. Arkle, Argivian Scholar. Yaya was down the stairs and less than halfway around the tower when she heard a crash of glass behind her, like a death knell. It was clear and crisp, and was followed by a loud, angry, meeping wail. The crashing cry was met by a curse, and the sound of slippered feet, running from the other direction, ahead of Yaya. She ducked through an open alcove to one side of the hall, little more than a wizard's pantry, lined with small drawers on all sides. Yaya flattened herself against the wall, closest to the sound of the approaching feet. She was rewarded by the sight of a blurred blue and white form of the royal mage, her dark hair trailing behind her like a banner, rushing past the stairs to the heart of her lair. As soon as Gasatha had rounded the curve and was out of sight, Yaya was in motion again, making for the front door of the mage's quarters. She was there, and then she was through. The archway of the door behind her lit up with a brilliant radiance, and a great bell sounded in the long hollow of the stairway, causing the entire tower to quiver, and near blasting her with its peals. Yaya plastered herself against the wall to avoid tumbling down the stairs and cursing herself. Of course she wouldn't set up any traps on the way in. She carried no magic. But now with the mirror, that was no longer the case. The fact that the glyphs activating and the alarm sounding indicate the mirror was a real item did little to console the taskmates as she hurtled down 2 levels of stairs, making for the guest chambers. She made it down 2 floors safely, although from below she now heard shouts and the running of heavy-booted feet. They'd be up here in a few minutes. Their magical sendings would be up here sooner. Yaya shook her head to clear her mind, and whipped up a little magical present of her own. She snapped her fingers and pointed. A phantom dragon, as intangible as a shadow in the wind, snaked down along the stairway into the lower levels of the tower. It had little power and less effect, but it would disrupt anything they would be sending up to her and keep them off balance. Yaya opened the door to the guest level and ran directly into the mage and mechanic that she had encountered earlier. They reeled back as if Yaya was a poisonous snake. Yaya caught her breath and gasped. "There's a thief in the tower, up in the royal mage's quarters. Go to her. I'll get help." The 2 pressed past her, and Yaya watched their backs, shaking her head. Then she made her way quickly to the guest quarters, where her gear was stored. As she passed each doorway, more gowing sounded from the deep within the tower. Jodah's mirror was packing some heavy mana, and it tripped runes and glyphs even as it passed. She made it through the doorway, setting off the entire arch in a rainbow of color, and shucked out her scholar's robes in a single action. She secured the grappling hook and let the line out the window. Yaya checked the mirror, still nestled inside her dark shirt, and threw herself out of the opening. She grasped a line with her gloved hands and landed feet first against the tower. Slowly and carefully she dropped a few feet, letting the line play out through her hands, and landed again. Drop, land, drop, land. With luck, she'd be able to reach the ground before they even knew she was out of the tower itself. She looked up and cursed. The royal mage was not waiting for the tower to be searched. Already pale blue phantoms danced around the top of the tower. Gathatha's summonings. Apparently the royal mage, like some fabled dragon, knew exactly what was missing from her hoard, just by looking at her pile of treasure. Yaya took bigger leaps, letting the line play out more fully, almost plummeting down the side of the tower. The rope whirred through her gloved hands, and she could feel the heat through the thick padding. Still, she was making good time, and she needed to. The phantasms were slowly descending like clouds. Yaya landed hard, and her left leg complained of the impact. Yaya snarled and fled the base of the tower, leaving the rope still attached. It mattered little to her now that she had left a clear indication of how she'd broken in. The noise from the tower was already starting to attract attention. Other towers in the city now sprang to life, beacons in the night. The Royal Academy was abuzz, and now people were spilling out into the street from the taverns and houses to see what was the matter. They gawked upwards, watching dim magical shapes cross from one tower to the next. Now the phantoms were joined with more solid forms. Skyknights, mounted on great aethirs, predatory birds that patrolled the heavens. Yaya turned and gawked at the crowds, stepping back slowly again and again. The best way to attract attention was to be seen fleeing the scene of a crime. The best way to hide was to join the masses. Finally, she had reached the back edge of the crowd. She turned, and was looking into the breastplate of a large Kajadorian knight. She looked up. The soldier had the huge winged helmet and the ornate medallion that marked him as an elite guard. Only his helmet was slightly askew, and the medallion had been quickly half-tucked into the breastplate. The guardsman seemed to regard her from beneath sagging, exhausted eyebrows. "What the few is happening?" he demanded. His breast was heavily laden with alcohol and onions, and it nearly knocked her off her feet. Yaya opened her eyes wide, trying to look as innocent as possible. She remembered the royal mage's owl familiar, and strove for the same look on her own face. "Some kind of wizard battle," she said. "Up at the Royal Academy." The great helm soldier looked up at the spiring patterns in the sky and sneered. "Damn mages. If it's not one thing with those moth-eaten book-bangers, it's another." He turned to one side and spat. "Yes, sir," said Yaya, blinking at the tar man. "Well, you'd better come with me, and we'll see what's the matter." Yaya walked forward, touching her hand to her forehead, pressing against the elite guardsman's chest. Almost at once she strayed again. "I'm so sorry," she said, blushing in a torch-lit street. "I don't know what came over me. Too much excitement. If you could only see me to my inn." The guardsman's sagging brows narrowed, and Yaya could see he was strongly considering the possibility. Then something like a blue-green star exploded overhead, and he looked up at the night sky, crisscrossed with gigantic birds and phantom creature. He shook his head. "You'd best be running along, missy. It looks like it'll be a long night." "Thank you, sir," Yaya said, bobbing her head in a suffocating manner, and headed on her way. Behind her, she could hear the elite guardsmen bellowing at the crowds to disperse, or feel the full might of Kajadorian justice. She made her way quickly to the nearest of the Skyknight's barrack. Their towers were not as tall as those of the mages, but they were wider, for they had the roosts of the great birds of the Skyknights. There were half a dozen of the great domed aeries in the city itself, and other outposts scattered throughout the kingdom. Her original plan was to sneak into the barrack. Now she strode through the front door, flashing the elite guardsman's medal, which she had filched when she was leaning against him. The medallion had the desired effect. The barrack guard stiffened to attention as she breezed past. Inside was the pandemonium that followed the launch of the Skyknight's flight. Servants everywhere, squires gathering their master's cast-off gear, others readying the nest for their return. Yaya was ignored as she passed through the mob, making her way to one particular room in the barrack. Skyknight officers raided their own rooms, and all Skyknights were considered officers. She slipped inside to find a simple set of quarters, a bunk, a table, 2 chairs, an armoire with several sets of uniforms, and a broad central shelf, a wooden squire that would hold its owner's armor, empty for the moment. Yaya nodded approvingly. She opened the armoire and climbed in, bent down on the broad shelf. She laid back against the armoire's wall, and pulled the mirror from her shirt. In the darkness, it seemed to glow of its own volition. Yaya closed her eyes, and waited for the commotion outside to die down. She was awakened by the sound of the door slamming open, striking the wall and banging back into its frame, followed by the slow, exhausted dragging of booted feet across the stone. Yaya pushed the armoire's door open as a slender, blonde-haired woman in Skyknight's armor slumped into one of the chairs. Bad day at the office, honey? Yaya chirped. The Skyknight was on her feet at once, her hand gripping her short dagger. Then she recognized who was speaking and gave the task mage a wary nod. Why am I not surprised you'd show around now, said the Skyknight. It's fate, Lieutenant Bell. It's providence. It's one of the mysteries of magic. Yaya beamed at the Skyknight. The task mage slipped from her perch and pulled 2 goblets along with a dusty wine bottle of dubious vintage. Belinda Dansdaughter looked over the tabletop at the task mage and her gift. I spent half the night sweeping the city looking for some powerful and dangerous wizard at the orders of the royal mage. What makes me think that said wizard was you? Mage I be, Belinda, but powerful? Dangerous? Teased Yaya, pausing only to pull the cork from the bottle's neck with her teeth. She sniffed at the wine, wrinkled her nose, and spat the cork to the far corner of the room. She poured 2 glasses of the thick red wine, with Belinda's portion being the larger. I am but a humble task mage, she concluded, a wizard of bits and pieces, and as such, below the gaze of such powerful wizards as Gustatha Elbsdaughter. Belinda made a rude noise, and took a long pull at her wine, her face clouding immediately. Where did you get this swill? Back of your own closet, said Yaya smartly, taking a sip of her own wine and fighting the urge to spit back out. I think Jarkeld himself laid it down in anticipation of his victory over the goblins. Don't joke. The Skyknight, panther thin and muscular, as one has to be to ride and control the huge birds, stroked her chin. Of course, the royal mage assumed a powerful wizard broke in, and then vanished without leaving a clue, when it could simply be a common thief with more moxie than brains, said Yaya. You match that description all right, interrupted Belinda. And enough knowledge to know that certain buildings in Grubb would be proof from the royal mage's direct scrying, finished Yaya. Such as the Skyknight's barrack, snorted Belinda, and took a pull on her goblet. Apparently the first gulp killed most of the taste buds. So what did you steal? Something that did not belong to Gusty anyway, said Yaya primly. That's beside the point, said Belinda. She regarded Yaya over the top of the mug. Give it up, lassie. Yaya pulled out the mirror and placed it on the tabletop, hoping that her face would not betray the item's true value. The Skyknight picked it up and turned it over in her hands. Looks simple enough, she said. Kinda creepy feeling. Magical? Yaya settled in her chair and made a production of topping off her own goblet of untouched wine. She nodded. Belinda slid the mirror back across the table. Yaya picked it up leisurely and tucked it into her shirt. The Skyknight took another sip of wine. So it is valuable. To its original owner, replied Yaya. And who would that be? Belinda raised 2 fingers to prompt Yaya's response. A friend, replied Yaya. Belinda's eyebrows shot up. You still have friends? Yaya looked at the Skyknight calmly. I'd like to think so. So this thingamabob, said Belinda. It doesn't call down the sky, or open the pits of Phyrexia, or anything that might threaten the kingdom, does it? If it did, I wouldn't have handed it over, would I? Argued Yaya. Belinda took a sip of her wine and tilted her head towards Yaya. And what will you be wanting this time? The usual, said Yaya. A ride out of town. I assume that old Gusty has the city sealed. You're damn right on that, said Belinda. She had us running around like headless chickens, checking the dock, checking the barges, checking the merchant caravans, rolling through the foreigners' quarter. Pah! Like she knows how to run a military operation. That's the trouble these days, Yaya. There are too many mages running things, too many merchants with their fingers in the pudding, and not enough real warriors. Martin Strongguard, Jarkeld himself, those were leaders, not these naive child king and his wizard toadies. The Skyknight leaned back in her chair. No offense meant. None taken, replied the task mage. Belinda looked at Yaya for a long time, then said, Why do I only see you when you need something? Because crisis draws us together, said Yaya. And you need me. I've done you a few favors. Belinda started. And how long are you going to ride that horse? Till it collapses from exhaustion, said Yaya. But it comes with gifts, in this case. The task mage fished out the guardian's medallion and tossed it across the table. The circular just spun and rang in front of the Skyknight. Belinda Dansdaughter let out a low whistle. That's an elite icon. How do you get one? I left him alive, if that's your question, said Yaya. Belinda hefted the medallion and grunted. Remind me why I'm helping you again? Yaya sighed. Because you know I didn't do anything really horrible. Because you have an innate sense of Kejildorian justice. Because I helped you with your first flight training. Because I'm giving you the medallion, which should be worth a few brownie points and the bragging rights with the elite guard when you hand it over. And because you, and most of your other knights, don't really like the royal mage at all. Gusty the royal pain, muttered Belinda, taking a deep sigh. Okay, you win. But I really need a good sleep. You were nestled in the armoire? It'll do, said Yaya. It'll have to, replied Belinda, because I plan to sleep at least until noon. Actually, it was late afternoon before they left the Eyrie. Yaya spent most of the afternoon fidgeting, waiting for Belinda to pull herself together for the flight. Finally, the Skyknight appeared with a large satchel, which he tossed at the task mage. You get to play squire for the flight, said the lean Skyknight. Come on. The sack was heavy, and Yaya wondered if Belinda put all of her wearing belongings into it, just to spite the task mage. Still, Yaya put up her hood, no use begging to be identified, hoisted the sack on her shoulder, and stumbled after the wiry Skyknight. The Skyknight barrack in the city of Krav, and throughout Kejildor itself, were of similar design. A legacy that stretched, it was said, back to Urza himself. Yaya could find her way around them blindfolded, as could most of the Skyknights. They resembled nothing so much as a great circular mushroom, blossoming from the landscape, their circular bases rising from the surrounding buildings, then umbrellaing out into the rookery, was the Eyrie proper, where the great birds were kept. The lower floors held the guards, the offices, the private quarters for the Skyknights, but really, all that was below existed to support what was above. It was, for all intents and purposes, a stable, the one for aerial creatures. The entire top floor, the bulbous top of the mushroom, was a single dome, a wooden framework supported by great fabric sheets, which kept the worst of the winter at bay. Openings had been cut into cardinal points and covered with great flaps, and the top of the dome was open for smoke from the central hearth to escape. When Yaya had first seen Krav, the Skyknight's barracks reminded her of the steaming toadstools rising above the cold white buildings of the royal city. Beneath the dome were the roosts of the Aether, the great birds that were at the heart and soul of the Skyknights. These great birds were the reason the Skyknights were better than their friendly rivals in the various holy orders of the military, and even, to the Skyknights' way of thinking, superior to the elite guards themselves. Once the Aethers were wild raptors, predatory hawks that roosted in the Capulsian mountains, but the climatic changes that brought the rivers of ice southward took their toll. The great passes between the peaks filled with snow and ice, and the Carplusian mountain range was buried. The Aether's body was covered with thick white feathers, from head to thighs, while the wing feathers were a cascade of blue-grays. The way these feathers moved and ruffled always made Yaya think of a great blue sea, filled with white bergs. Kejildor herself was said to have tamed the first one, long before the founding of the city. In the years since then, the Skyknights had been one of the most noble of the various military factions of Kejeld, and the proudest. Now, walking among the great perches in the rookery, watching the Skyknights and their squires clean and preen their mounts, Yaya was struck by the connection between knight and mount. The other orders, even those with their own cavalry, considered the Skyknights excessive in their dedication to their mounts. Yaya, for her part, considered their care and attention to be merely prismatic. Several hundred feet above the ground, it paid to be on good terms with your transportation. For their part, the various knights, squires, and servants ignored Yaya. Belinda's Aether was particularly large and had hard yellow eyes, like slices of amber. It regarded Yaya like a hawk would a mouse, and Yaya secretly hoped that the rapport between knight and mount reminded the Aether that the taskmate was a friend, not a meal. The squire had already prepared the Aether for flight. A leather sander was mounted behind the head, looking like nothing more than a collar on the great bird, and a bridle had been fitted over its great beak. Belinda pulled a slab of raw meat from a nearby bin and approached the great beast, speaking soft words. The Aether's attention shifted from the task mage to the preferred snack, and the huge bird bent its head down towards Belinda. The Skyknight stroked the feathers behind the bird's crown, as the huge raptor took the meat from its master's hands. Then effortlessly the great bird raised its neck, tilted its head back, and the slide of beast slid effortlessly down its gullet. Belinda smiled and unhitched the bird's reins from the mooring post. The Aesir followed Belinda, waddling unevenly on its sickle-taloned legs. It seemed portly, almost top-heavy, as the Skyknight led it towards the northern portal. Yaya followed, still struggling with the heavy sack. Belinda stood out for a moment at the platform's edge and looked out at the city of Krav, its stone buildings stacked one upon the other beneath them. Far to the north, at the edge of the vision, a thin white line ran across the horizon. That was the glacier, supposedly kept from advancing and crushing Kejildor only by the spells of the royal mage and her minions. Yaya shivered in the north breeze, a steady wind that started at the edge of the great ice sheet and flowed unimpeded towards her. "Are we going to go?" asked Yaya, pulling her furs tighter around her, or are we just going to admire the city? Belinda turned, and Yaya expected some sharp rebuke about the task mage's lack of aesthetic appreciation. Instead, the muscular Skyknight simply nodded, and gave a particular command through the reins. The Aether bent down again, and Belinda mounted behind its head, freeing herself in the saddle. The Skyknight waved for Yaya to hand up the satchel, and she fastened the bag securely ahead of the pommel. Only then did Belinda offer assistance to Yaya. The task mage grabbed at the preferred hand, and the Skyknight swung Yaya behind her on the great bird. Then Belinda kicked her heels into the Aethir's neck, hard. Yaya was not prepared for the Skyknight's suddenness, which was just as well, as she always dreaded the first few moments. The great bird spread its wings and took off from the eyrie. Actually, it leaned forward and fell off the edge of the rookery, its massive wings spreading and catching the cold air beneath it. For the first few seconds, they were free-falling. Then the mighty wings began to beat, and the Aethir started to climb over the city. Belinda and the other Skyknights Yaya had talked to swore that it was one of the most enjoyable things about the patrols with these great birds. That initial rush as the wind swept past them, threatening to pull the rider out of her saddle and into oblivion. As far as Yaya was concerned, she would rather practice casting fireballs in a small room. It seemed safer to her somehow. They spiraled outward over the white jumble of Grubb, taking a leisurely arc over the city. Below them, she could see the wide open-air markets and newer canvas-covered ones. She could see the other Skyknight aeries, 6 in all, scattered over the city, and she could see the massive squat blocks and towers of King Darian's castle, and beyond them, the ornate, thin spires of the Royal Academy of Magic. She shrank against Belinda, worried that this would be the moment now that she was beyond the protections of the barracks, when the royal mage might decide to cast a divination to reveal where her stolen trinket was. She felt the mirror inside her tunic, pressed against her bare flesh, and it felt warm and dangerous. They passed over the walls, and beneath them Yaya could see the merchant traffic, actually slow at this time of the year, plotted at the gates leaving the city. Gustava held enough power in the city to tie up even the most powerful merchants, though the task mage knew that such actions would not last forever in the face of the infuriating merchant guilds. They flew west and north, towards the ice sheet. She had told Belinda where she wanted to be dropped, and the Skyknight knew the place, a moraine field, where the glacier had carved up a deposit of mica and sent it in a glittering cascade ahead of the advancing wall of ice. Yaya knew it as the Glimmer Vale. The Skyknights knew it as the Fool's Gold Gulch. There was no chance of talk in flight, and for that Yaya was grateful. The Aethir would soar, for the most part, its great wings catching the slightest thermals riding off the cold land. But even so, the wind howled around the riders, and left Yaya with her thoughts. Inside she felt as cold as her exposed cheeks and eyebrows. She trusted Frelis to tell the truth, that the mirror she held would cure Jodah. What if this was one more half-truth? One more partial piece of the puzzle? What would she do then? Walk back to Latnam herself? To present Jodah at the gates of the School of the Unseen? And expect the treacherous Gerda to do something about it? They flew for the remainder of the day, descending only when the sun at last dropped beneath the horizon. Belinda set them down on the plateau, and as Yaya set up a rough, high tent and laid a fire, magically lit of course, the Skyknight took her mount out to forage for dinner. Just as the last rays of the sun were fleeing the plateau, the pair returned. The great raptor held something grey and red in its claws. Yaya thought that at one time, say 20 minutes earlier, it might have been a direwolf. The warm, bloody meal was for the Aethir, who tore huge goblets out of the corpse and downed them with relish. For Yaya and Belinda, it was a cold tack and hard cheese, washed down with the remains of the ancient red wine, warmed in a tin pot over the fire. The wine tasted no better warm than it did cold, but it seemed to rush into Yaya's system faster. Belinda said nothing, but looked into the fire. Finally Yaya said, "Core for your thoughts, spell?" "And a pile of gold for an epiphany," replied the Skyknight, finishing the old saying. "I was just thinking about, well, how bad things have gotten." Yaya pulled her furs closer. "It's gotten colder, and nastier with every winter." Belinda Danestar shook her head. "That's not what I mean. I mean in Cajaldor. The cold seems to have been suckling the life out of us as a people. Darian is at best a weak king, naive, dominated by merchants who see the military only as a way of settling their own internecine rivalries. I've been to Kajeld only twice during the summer months, but each time to deliver some message to one of the merchant houses. We're the Skyknights, the best, the most elite of the military orders, and we are now no more than messengers and scouts. These are difficult times," Yaya said, the cold threatening to defeat even her inner fire. Belinda nodded. "Meanwhile, more and more of the farms and small towns are being abandoned, and more of the people are looking to us for protection. And what are we? Messenger boys for the merchants?" Belinda spat, and Yaya was positive the spittle was frozen before it hit the ground. We've always been a proud order. You are needed, said Yaya, as examples, as leaders, and as protectors. Limdul's undead are on the rise. Belinda shook her head. The necromancer is no threat, Yaya. You're listening too much to the nonsense that the Academy spouts, but Belinda shook her head. The necromancer is no threat, Yaya. You're listening too much to the nonsense that the Academy spouts to the king's supporters. No offense to your magical abilities, but the necromancer is easier contained. His supposed troops, nothing more than bones and dead flesh. Yaya shrugged beneath her furs, thinking of Limdul's guards, thinking of the thing that almost killed her and Jodah in the cave. She did not want to irritate her ride over politics, and local politics at that. Still, she had something to say. There are reports from the small farms that Limdul's creatures are more than just that. That's why the farmers are fleeing. Belinda raised an arm theatrically, and Yaya wondered if she had done the wisest thing in letting the Skyknight have the bulk of the wine. What they're fleeing is the cold, and the barbarians. That's the true threat. Barbarians. The ice is driving that lot south in the Keljadorian lands. They're overrunning our traditional territory, and that's what's the royal pain, and our merchant cronies are missing. The dead don't care about the land. The barbarians do. Someone has to take a stand to make Keljador supreme again. Still, you can't discount the stories, prodded Yaya. Hysteria, said Belinda, egged on by the merchants and mystics. I always thought you were smarter than to fall to that codswallop. Oh, I know you're a mage, but you don't like Gusta and her lot any more than I do. That's why you knew I'd help you out. Yaya said nothing but nodded. And why? Because I hate what's happened to us. I hate the division and the weakness and the softness. Belinda leaned closer over the fire and spoke in a low voice. And there are some of us who won't be taken in by it. Yaya leaned away. The last thing she needed was to get involved in a conspiracy, particularly someone else's conspiracy. What do you mean? Yaya asked. Who are you speaking for? A few choice men and women, said Belinda, rocking back on her haunches, growing by leaps and bounds in all the military orders. Those who remain faithful to the past, who remember the stories of Jarkhold and Stormgald and Keljadors herself, and are willing to do what's necessary to save this great nation from itself. I don't think Kejeld is its own worst enemy, said Yaya. You already have the glaciers, the barbarians, and Dim Bulb himself. Yaya snorted. You're not listening. The necromancer can be handled, and I've heard tales that the glaciers would have melted long ago, if not for the mages seeking to maintain their own power. And as for the barbarians, she stroked her chin. Well, they are always a danger, bloody savages, but as soon as we rally the people, they'll be hauling their coward sheepskin hides back over the mountains. That I guarantee you. Are you talking revolution? Asked Yaya. I'm talking. Belinda smacked her lips together, as if trying to taste the proper word. Adjustment. Keljador needs an adjustment. In its thinking, in its morals, and in its power. I think those loyal to the true greatness of the past can make that adjustment. Yaya tried to nod in a calm, non-committal way. And you're telling me this because? Belinda shrugged. We could use a bolt caster or two in our numbers. I'm not that stiff-necked to realize that a spellcaster would be useful as an ally, even a simple task mage. Ah, said Yaya. That's part of my point. I'm a simple task mage, which means I don't do evolutions unless there's a payoff involved. Yaya tried to be flippant, but Belinda sank into herself as the task mage answered. After a cold moment, the Skyknight said, So this little unpleasantness in the Royal Pain's Tower, that has a payoff? Yaya thought of the last time she saw Jodah, his hands bound to keep him from hurting himself, his throat raw and strained from the screaming, his muscles clenched in madness. She nodded. A big enough payoff for me. Belinda made a grunting noise and said, Well, think about it. That's all I can ask. Sleep on it. With that, she downed the rest of her wine, and went to bed down the 8th year for the night. Yaya cleaned up after the meal and crawled into the small tent. When Belinda slid in, Yaya kept her eyes closed and her breathing regular, feigning sleep that would not come. She really did not want to pursue the matter any further. In the morning, Belinda left it to Yaya to pack up the field tent as the Skyknight took the Aesir out to hunt. They brought back a small worm, white, pale, and looking like a multi-legged larva. Then they were aloft again, and flew for most of the day before reaching their destination. Beneath them, the mica churned by the glacier shone like diamonds beneath the clear sky. Belinda brought the Aesir down, and Yaya slid from its back. Belinda didn't bother to dismount. Have you thought about what I've said? Yaya gave a shrug beneath her furs. I am my own master, Belle. You know that. But what you say sounds plausible. But I'm not one for revolutions. I think there are greater dangers to you without than within. Belinda gave a disappointed grunt and looked at the horizon. Are you sure you want to be here? I think I spotted some barbarian huts not too far away. Yaya shrugged again. That's where I'm headed. Belinda looked hard at Yaya. Those savages are barely human. You want help? Yaya flashed a smile meant to be stronger than it was. I can manage. I brought my own help with me. She touched her chest and felt the mirror beneath it. You said it belonged to a friend, said Belinda. This friend wouldn't happen to be one of those knuckle-dragging ice apes, would it? Yaya chose her words carefully. My friend is currently in the hands of those barbarians. Belinda hunched on the other side of her saddle and said, Are you sure you don't need any help? Yaya pulled herself up to her full height. Since when does even a task mage need help with ice ape spell? Belinda raised her hands. Just asking. Would hate to see anything happen to you after all this. Yaya gave a smile she felt from the heart. The same goes for you, Belinda, Dana's daughter. Do me a favor. Think things through yourself before you throw yourself in any group that's out to change the world. It may not be a change for the best. Belinda gave a chuckle and kneed the sides of her mount. The Aether spread its great wings and beat upwards, swirling the snow and mica chips around Yaya's legs. Yaya looked up, and the Skyknight gave a great wave. Yaya watched until Belinda was a small spot on the southern horizon, and made sure the Skyknight would not return to help. Only then did she make her way down to the uneven mica-strewn slope towards the barbarian encampment. Belinda waited until she was far enough south of the gulch to be unseen by Yaya. Only then did she pull at the reins, steering the great Aether towards the west, towards the keep of Trestlehorn. This concludes Chapter 8 of our saga. If you enjoyed the tale so far, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow us on both YouTube and your preferred podcast platform. Your support means the world to us. Until next time, may your adventures be as boundless as the plains themselves. Thank you for listening.